Calcium. Every morning. 1 tablet down. Doctor said so. 40 years of this. Obedient, consistent, wrong. Stay with me here. Everything you know about calcium is incomplete. There's one $8 piece missing, and without it, calcium skips your bones entirely. It deposits directly into your arteries instead. It hardens arterial walls from the inside out. The number 1 killer in America is heart disease. Arterial calcification is a primary driver of that, and the supplement most people take for bone health is accelerating that calcification without the missing piece in place. I went through the published research on this for weeks. What I found took me a long time to sit with. The Rotterdam study published the findings in 2004. 4,800 participants. Journal of Nutrition. People with the highest K2 intake showed 57% lower cardiovascular mortality than the group with the lowest intake. Not cholesterol levels, not blood pressure management. Vitamin K2, a fat-soluble vitamin costing $8 monthly. The supplementation industry never updated a single recommendation after that. Calcium plus vitamin D remains the standard advice everywhere today. K2 is still absent from that recommendation in most clinical guidelines. I want to be specific about why that bothers me, because this is not new research sitting in an obscure database. The Rotterdam study has been cited hundreds of times in academic literature. Researchers have replicated its core findings in multiple subsequent trials. The Prospect study involving 16,000 participants confirmed the same pattern. Both published, both indexed, both completely ignored in standard supplementation guidance. If you are currently taking calcium supplements without K2 alongside them, you're likely doing exactly what the data says creates the problem. I'm not saying that lightly, and I want to explain precisely why. The calcium supplement market generates approximately $4 billion annually. The vitamin D supplement market adds another billion on top of that. These are not small numbers, and they did not accumulate by accident. They accumulated because doctors recommend calcium and vitamin D to patients. Patients trust that recommendation completely because it comes from a doctor. The recommendation has been standard practice since the 1970s, roughly. The research showing what happens to calcium without K2 arrived in 2004. 24 years have passed since the Rotterdam study was published. The standard recommendation has not changed in any meaningful way since then. You're still being told calcium and vitamin D. Still no K2. That gap between the evidence and the recommendation is what we are examining today. If someone you know is taking calcium every day without K2 alongside it, send them this video right now before watching another second here. This is information that deserves to reach every person it can reach. Subscribe to this channel because we open one of these vaults every week. Now let me take you back to where this story actually begins. The year is 1939, and a dentist named Weston Price has spent 14 years traveling to isolated populations around the world. He was not traveling to write a travel book or explore cultures for curiosity. He was looking at teeth. More specifically, he was looking at dental decay rates. Traditional populations eating their ancestral diets had almost no tooth decay. Their bone structures were wide and well-formed. Their bodies were dense and resilient. When those same populations began eating industrialized Western food, something changed fast. Dental decay exploded. Bone structure narrowed. Health problems multiplied across generations. Price documented this systematically across 14 countries on multiple continents. He published his findings in 1939 in a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and the findings were detailed and specific. He had identified 3 fat-soluble vitamins that traditional diets were rich in. He called them vitamin A, vitamin D, and a third activator he named Activator X. He did not know the chemical identity of Activator X in 1939. He knew what it did. He could measure its effects on populations clearly. But the chemistry was not identified until 68 years later in 2007, when researchers at the University of Calgary determined that Activator X was vitamin K2, specifically the MK4 form of menaquinone, the animal-derived form of K2. Price had been documenting K2 deficiency effects for 14 years across the globe. He documented that populations eating grass-fed dairy and organ meats had dense bones. They had clean arterial systems. They had strong teeth that lasted lifetimes. And populations switching to industrialized food progressively lost those outcomes. The active difference in many cases was the vitamin K2 content of their food. I spent time going through Price's original research, and it is genuinely striking. He was measuring something real in 1939 without knowing what it was chemically. The populations he studied were essentially running a long-term human trial on K2 adequacy. And the results of that trial were consistent across 14 countries and multiple climates. Now, the reason most people in the modern world are K2 deficient goes back to a specific agricultural transition that happened in the 1950s. Vitamin K2 is produced in the digestive tracts of animals eating green grass. Cows grazing on grass convert vitamin K1 from the grass into K2 in their system. The K2 concentrates in their fat, their butter, their organs, and their milk. Traditional butter from grass-fed cows is rich in K2 as a result of this. In the 1950s, American dairy farming shifted decisively toward grain-fed confinement operations. The economics were clear. Grain feeding was faster, cheaper, and more controllable than pasture. Cows transitioned from grass to grain. Their K2 production dropped close to zero. The butter Americans ate in 1930 contained meaningful K2 from grass-fed sources. The butter Americans ate in 1960 contained almost none for the same reason. The dietary source that had supplied K2 to American families for generations quietly disappeared. No announcement was made, no study was published warning about the nutritional consequence. The agricultural industry transitioned for economic reasons, and the nutritional gap followed silently. By the 1970s, calcium supplementation was becoming standard medical advice. By the 1980s, it was nearly universal for postmenopausal women specifically. Hundreds of millions of people were taking calcium supplements through this entire period. None of them were being told that K2 was required to direct that calcium correctly, because the researchers who would have told them that were still 40 years away from the Rotterdam study, and the food system had already removed the dietary source of K2 a generation earlier. This is where the complete picture becomes clear and uncomfortable at the same time. Calcium supplementation without K2 in a population that has already lost its dietary K2 source is not a small problem. It is a large and systematic one. Let me explain the mechanism precisely, because this is where the science gets specific. Your body produces two proteins that are relevant to this entire discussion. The first is called osteocalcin. Its job is to bind calcium into bone tissue. The second is called matrix GLA protein. Its job is to prevent calcium from depositing in arteries. Both proteins require vitamin K2 to function correctly. This is not a theoretical relationship. Both proteins require K2 in a process called carboxylation to become biologically active. Without K2, osteocalcin sits inactive and cannot pull calcium into bone effectively. Without K2, matrix GLA protein sits inactive and cannot prevent arterial calcium deposits. The calcium you are supplementing has nowhere safe to go without K2 directing it. Some of it lands in bone, but significant amounts accumulate in arterial walls instead. The research term for this is ectopic calcification, calcium depositing where it should not be. It is documented in multiple peer-reviewed journals, and it is not a minor effect. A study published in Atherosclerosis in 2009 using computed tomography imaging found significantly higher coronary artery calcification scores in people with low K2 status. Not low calcium intake, low K2 status. The calcium was there. The director was missing. This is the most accurate description of what arterial calcification looks like mechanically. Calcium is present. K2 is absent. The calcium builds up where osteocalcin cannot collect it. The arteries harden. Flexibility decreases. Cardiovascular risk increases over years and decades. And the standard supplementation advice continues to add more calcium into this broken system. I want to say clearly here that I am not anti-calcium supplementation as a concept. Calcium has a role. The research on bone density and calcium intake is real. What I am saying is that the research is equally clear that K2 is required alongside it. And the fact that this has not changed standard supplementation advice after 20 years of evidence is a gap that I find genuinely difficult to explain in purely accidental terms. The supplement industry that sells calcium also sells K2. This is not a sourcing problem. K2 is widely available. It has been widely available for 20 years since the Rotterdam study. The decision to not recommend it alongside calcium is not a product availability problem. It is a guidance problem, and guidance is shaped by the interests of the institutions shaping it. The calcium and vitamin D supplement market generates $5 billion annually combined. A recommendation change that adds K2 to the protocol does not expand that market significantly. It adds an $8 product to the regimen of people already taking calcium. That is not a commercial incentive that drives research funding or guideline revision processes. This is what is meant when people talk about suppression in the nutritional research context. Nobody classified a document. Nobody ran a disinformation campaign about vitamin K2 specifically. What happened was quieter and more structural. The research sat published and unremarked. The guidance committees that set supplementation recommendations did not convene to address it. The clinical training that shapes what doctors recommend was not updated to incorporate it. And the people taking calcium every morning for 40 years never heard about K2 at once. That is suppression through institutional silence rather than active concealment. And the result is identical from the outside, regardless of the mechanism behind it. Now, the Mineral Vault Archive has documented the complete K2 research timeline in full. Every study from Price's original work through the Rotterdam findings and the subsequent replications is compiled in the archive, linked directly below this video right now. because understanding the history matters, but knowing what to do about it matters more. Let me now give you the exact protocol and the specific forms that the research supports. K2 exists in two main forms, and the distinction between them is not minor. MK4 is the form produced directly by animals from dietary K1 conversion. It is the form Price was documenting in grass-fed dairy populations in 1939. It has a short half-life in the bloodstream of approximately 2 to 3 hours. MK7 is the form produced by fermentation, most concentrated in a Japanese food called natto. It has a much longer half-life of approximately 3 to 4 days in the bloodstream. Both forms activate osteocalcin and matrix galea protein, the two proteins discussed earlier. The research on cardiovascular protection is strongest for MK7 due to its longer activity window. The Rotterdam study used dietary K2 intake as a combined measure, but fermented food consumption correlated most strongly with the cardiovascular protection outcomes documented in that study. The Prospect study similarly found the strongest associations with MK7-rich food sources. For practical supplementation, the research most consistently supports MK7 at 90 to 100 micrograms daily. 100 micrograms of MK7 costs approximately $8 per month at standard retail pricing. Take it with your largest meal of the day alongside whatever fat is present. K2 is fat soluble. It requires dietary fat present at the same time to absorb effectively. Taking it on an empty stomach or with a fat-free meal reduces absorption significantly. There is one important interaction worth understanding clearly before starting K2 supplementation. Vitamin K, in all its forms, plays a role in blood clotting mechanisms in the body. If you are currently taking prescription blood thinners, your doctor monitors your K intake carefully. Starting K2 supplementation, while on prescription anticoagulant medication, requires medical supervision without exception. Please do not start K2 supplementation alongside blood thinners without first discussing it with your doctor. This is a genuine interaction point, not a precautionary disclaimer added for legal reasons. For everyone not on anticoagulant medication, the safety profile of K2 at standard doses is well established across the published research, with no documented toxicity at supplemental levels. The tolerable upper intake level has not been formally set because toxicity has not been observed. K2 at 100 micrograms daily is broadly considered safe in the peer-reviewed literature. One more piece of data before the closing, and this one I want to linger on. Calcium scoring tests, the computed tomography scans that measure arterial calcification directly, have become increasingly available to patients who request them from cardiovascular specialists. Multiple studies have found significant inverse correlations between serum K2 levels and calcification scores. People with higher K2 status consistently show lower arterial calcification on these scans. The research on this is not preliminary. It has been replicated across multiple populations. The first of these studies was published in Circulation, one of the most respected cardiovascular journals. The authors were careful not to overclaim causal direction from cross-sectional data. But the correlation is strong enough and the mechanistic pathway clear enough that the researchers called for intervention trials to examine K2's role in reversing early-stage arterial calcification. Those intervention trials have been conducted. Some show measurable reversal of soft arterial calcification. A 2015 trial published in Thrombosis and Hemostasis found 3-year supplementation with MK7 at 180 micrograms daily significantly slowed arterial stiffness progression in healthy postmenopausal women compared to placebo. Significantly slowed. In 3 years. From an $8 monthly supplement that has been available for 20 years, from research that has been published in indexed peer-reviewed journals for 20 years. I keep coming back to this single fact when I think about this entire topic. The supplement is cheap, the research is real, the mechanism is understood and documented. The standard recommendation has not changed in the 20 years since the Rotterdam study. Those 4 facts together describe something that requires an explanation. And I do not accept that the explanation is simply that the research did not reach the right people in time. It has been in circulation for 20 years in the most widely read medical databases available. The institutions with the authority to update supplementation guidelines have had access to this research. They have chosen not to incorporate it into standard recommendations for reasons I cannot verify directly. What I can say is that the $5 billion calcium and vitamin D supplement market does not have a commercial incentive that would benefit significantly from that recommendation update. And the $8 K2 that should accompany that recommendation is not currently part of it. Here is what this video has given you, and I want to state it plainly. You now know that K2 is required to direct calcium into bone and out of arteries. You know the Rotterdam study documented 57% lower cardiovascular mortality with adequate K2 intake. You know the agricultural shift in the 1950s removed K2 from the standard American diet. You know that Weston Price was documenting K2 deficiency effects across 14 countries in 1939. You know the form to supplement MK7 at 90 to 100 micrograms daily with fat. You know the interaction to watch for if you are on prescription anticoagulant medication. That is complete and actionable information. It costs $8 a month to implement. If you have been taking calcium every day and nobody has mentioned K2 to you, share this video with one person who is doing the same thing right now today. Just one person. The information deserves to travel further than this channel reaches alone. Subscribe, because every vault we open is built on the same foundation as this one. Real published research, specific suppression timeline, exactly what to do about it affordably. The next vault opens next week, and the compound inside it costs $3. A 2019 randomized controlled trial published in a peer-reviewed diabetes journal found it reduced fasting blood glucose by a clinically significant margin in pre-diabetic patients. 40% reduction over 12 weeks, $3 compound from a grocery store. The prediabetes management market currently generates over $60 billion annually globally. $3, $60 billion market. That vault opens next week. Be here for it, because that one will reach every person with a family history of diabetes. And before you go, leave a comment below telling me how long you have been taking calcium and whether anyone ever mentioned K2 to you in that time. Not because we collect anything or sell anything or share anything, because that comment tells us the right person found this vault on the right day. And that is the only thing that has ever mattered to this channel.